Um, I'm going to introduce Dr. Joshua Drew. So Dr. Joshua Drew, he heads the Coupled Human and Organismal Systems, or I love this acronym, the CHAOS Labs at SUNY's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. And I really had the great opportunity of collaborating with him over this summer. I've been inspired and excited by his enthusiasm for all topics, but particularly marine ecology. And he has a deep respect for indigenous cultures. Also, just his general willingness to go outside the box and use unconventional sources of information, as you'll see in this in the research that he's going to be presenting to us. So without further ado, Dr. Drew.
Oh, Randy, thank you so much. I'm right back at you, man. It has been such a fun time working with it. And thank you, Dan and Sachil, for making this happen and bringing us all together and allowing us to share some time on this beautiful day and thinking a lot about how we can explore these intersections between cultures and conservation. But I love this idea of phenomenological learning. So I want to start with a phenomena. So we want you to get onto the Jamboard. That's going to be our virtual way to express how excited we are about the stuff that we're going to go through today. And so that should be in the chat, which I'll double check. Yep, there it is. Okay. So if everybody gets on that, that's great. That's going to be our common forum for us to explore. And so we're going to start off with an object. This is an object from the Field Museum of Natural History where I used to work. And this is from the anthropological holdings. And so I want just your first responses. What is this thing? I mean, you probably have a clue, but what's it made out of? Why is it existing? What are the things that you see? What is this? What are some of the first adjectives that come to your mind when you say that? We just kind of, like Randy said, this is an emphatic statement to get your juices flowing.
Yeah, so I'm noticing people putting in like the shark teeth, rows of shark teeth, triangles. I see somebody said that it looks like a bird foot. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this is there's a lot of great ideas here. It does look like something from Game of Thrones. Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting object, and this object, we'll talk a lot about this in its kin moving forward. So this is a shark-toothed weapon from the Gilbert Islands that was made about the time of the Civil War. And so I'm going to spend a couple minutes here kind of walking you through some of the research that I've done with them. But I want to point out first and foremost that both Randy and I have drawn very, very heavily from indigenous knowledge sources here. And so we want to respect with, we want to reflect that and speak with respect and gratitude to those indigenous knowledge holders who have allowed us to do this research, who have allowed us to share that information and allowed all of us as a community here to be enriched by learning about these relationships, and none of this would have happened without the generosity of indigenous knowledge holders. And so while it's Randy and my name on it, like the actual knowledge creation was done by these traditional knowledge holders, and in some ways we're just sort of brokers on that in terms of distributing it around. So when you're working with knowledge held by indigenous people, we want to be really, really careful not to be sort of extricative about it, or to just extract the knowledge, but to be respectful and recognize, all of the generations that have come together to generate that. So, thank you very much to those both past and present who are sharing this knowledge with us. So the work that we're talking about today is some of the work that I've done, and it's done in the Gilbert Islands, which is an archipelago in the country of Kiribati. And Kiribati is a really interesting place for a number of reasons. It was first peopled about 3,000 years ago with Western contact in 1764. If people have heard about Kiribati today, it's probably in light of climate change, because the whole country the highest elevation in the country is about 2 meters. And so Kiribati is one of those countries that is really on the cutting edge or on the precipice of being eliminated because of climate change. And so I think it's really important to make sure that we look at the interrelationships between the Kiribati, the people from Kiribati, and the relationships that they've had with the reefs and the waters that surround those islands, because that is a relationship that is currently threatened because of climate change and other factors. So I wanted to talk about Kiribati. And Kiribati, particularly the Gilberts, it's a small archipelago with a very high population density. And so people being people, when you have not a lot of resources and you have a lot of people looking for those resources, conflict is going to arise. And the Kiribati people, when they got to the Gilberts, didn't have access to metal or firepower or gunpowder, things like that. So they made their culture work based on what things were available to them. And why do you need to create metal swords when you have big sharks swimming around? Because those teeth are pretty well effectively designed at cutting through flesh. And that's exactly what people were doing, is that to make an effective weapon, they took advantage of the natural resources and were able to construct these. So the main shaft is made out of coconut wood. And you can see that it is just festooned with these shark teeth. And here's a zoom in. They would attach the shark teeth by taking a tiny snail and drilling a hole through the teeth using that snail as a drill bit. And then you can see I'm pointing at my screen, you can't see it. There are two types of fiber. There's the light brown, that's the coconut fiber, and there's the dark, which is something I don't have, which is human hair. And so they would weave the coconut and the human hair together to form this incredibly tough and durable cord that would then affix the shark teeth to the weapons. And they came in a variety of sizes. So we've had daggers, we've got swords, we've got tridents, we've got these pole arms, which are 2.1 interns tall. I mean, they're really a massive size. And you may ask, sort of like, well, where did they get the shark teeth from? Well, they got them from the sharks. And so she'll specifically wanted me to tell you the story about how they got the sharks. So it was a two-man and it was men only team where they would go out on these outrigger canoes about 8 feet long, about a hip wide with an outrigger. And the first person would take these coconut shells, halves, that were then rung up on a string and go. And the cool thing about the genus Carcharinus, the genus that most sharks are in, is that they have a concave section of their skull that actually focuses in sound from above. And so these sharks would hear this sound, and those sound waves would be focused in onto their head so that they would definitely be able to hear it. And sharks really can only interact with things in one way, and that's with their mouth. So the shark would be, wonder what that is, and it would swim up. And the only way it can interact is by biting. And so it would reach back, and this is where you get quint, like the eyes rolling back and the jaws opening. And as that thing was going up for it, the guy would take that out, and he would take a really stout stick about that big around, a big dowel, and just jam it into the shark's mouth so that the shark couldn't actually close its jaws. And that dowel jammed into the mouth was then tied off to the bow of the canoe. Meanwhile, the guy in the back would take a noose and tie it off on the tail, and that would also be tied to the back. And so this canoe, 8-foot long canoe, would have, and based on the size of the teeth that we looked at, up to 15-foot long sharks alive, jammed in the throat and tied on the tail. And then, and only then, would they head back in, and they wouldn't dispatch the shark until they got to the beach. So if you think about it, they were in an 8-foot canoe with a 12-foot shark live and wriggling on the side of it, kind of paddling their way back in. They would pop it on the head with a club, and then they would cut it up and distribute the meat to everybody in the village. And the more that they were able to distribute, the sort of the more mana or cultural capital they were able to earn. And then and only then would they take the jaws out and the teeth out and use that to make their weapons. So one of the things we want to talk about in this educational resource is the relationship between the teeth and the weapons, right? So can I go back on this maybe? Um, so you can see that the shark, there's different types of shark teeth on here. And one of the really cool things that we did, right, these were collected to record cultural diversity. But because they were made out of biological material, they inadvertently collected biological diversity, this historical biological diversity. And so one of the things that was really cool is that by going through and looking at these, we were able to look at the shark teeth, and the shark teeth are specific to species. So you can look at a shark's tooth and tell what species it came from. So while the Ikiribas people were making these to make swords and for combat, they were inadvertently sampling the reefs for biologists 150 years in the future to be able to tell what those reefs were like. And this is really important because the first formal Western survey of fish in the Gilbert Islands didn't occur until the early 1900s, like 1911, 1912. And so that was 3 or 4 generations after these weapons were collected. And so we have a way to, because we're thinking a little bit outside the box, to go further back and sample the biodiversity before we had a chance to, before it was sort of collected for biological purposes. And that's exactly what we wanted to do. And I was fortunate enough to work at a museum, which was great because these were all on the 3rd floor where the ichthyology or the anthropology holdings were. But if I couldn't identify a tooth, I could drop down a level to the ichthyology department and I could get the answer straight from the, well, not the horse's mouth, but the shark's mouth. And I was able to be able to go back and forth. And that's why museums really have such an amazing ability to inform our views on the world. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to use these holdings to go back in time, to go back to the era of the U.S. Civil War. But think more globally, right? This is an era of expansionism. This is an area of whaling. This was an era that we saw great changes in our environment, and we wanted to see what the reefs looked like back then. And so we went through and we found that there are 18 total species of sharks that were used in making these weapons. But the thing that was really interesting is that 2 species, Carcharodontis obscura, so the dusky shark and the spot tail shark, these 2 were both present in the weapons. But when we go back and we look at the literature and we go back at those original fish surveys, they weren't found there. So I've outlined Kiribati in the red, and the blue and the dark blue is where these fish are currently found today. And you can see that as far as we know, these things were not part of the Kiribati culture. They weren't part of the waters, but that's because they went extinct before we looked. Right? And this is this idea of shadow biodiversity, of species that we lost before we ever had an idea that they were there. And as a conservation biologist, as a marine ecologist, that is something that really, really motivates me, because this represents the world dulling before we even become aware of it. This is a cultural amnesia where we forget how rich these waters once were. And what that means from a biological perspective is that when we're trying to think about setting up a protected area or setting up a management strategy, if we never knew that those reefs once contained this diversity of sharks, maybe we're selling ourselves short. Maybe we're not being as ambitious when thinking about conservation strategies as we could be. But also, this talk is not so much just about the fish, but it's about the people's relationships with the fish. And when you look at the Kiribati culture, sharks factor in their creation myths. Sharks factor in their songs and their dances. There's constellations named after sharks. The ceremonies that boys go through to become men involve sharks and shark teeth weapons. And so when we look at these 2 species being extirpated, that is locally extinct in an area, it not only represents a dulling of the biological diversity, but it also means that we are taking away the opportunity for today's Kiribati children to interact with the reef in the same way that their ancestors have. We are limiting their options, and we are reducing the diversity that they have available with. And so those songs and those creation myths and those constellations were named after a world that was richer than they can see now. And by doing this type of research and going back in time a little bit, we're able to shed a little bit of light as to what that world once looked like when those stories, when those songs, those dances, those constellations were named. And I think that's what, to me, really gets me excited about this world, is that it's not just that we're documenting a biological loss, because sadly that happens all the time. But I think it's really important to show that that biological loss also incurs a loss of cultural opportunities for boys and girls who are living there today to be able to relate to their waters in the same ways that their grandfathers and their grandmothers did.
Uh, Josh, sorry to interrupt you, but there are a couple of questions that I think are
Yeah.
pretty interesting. So first of all, I think from Michael Hirsch, there's a trend between human migration and extinction of large mammals that lived in that area. Is there a trend between extinction of larger creatures and human migration? So
So
that's question.
yeah, so we know that these things were there when the Ikiribas arrived, right? Because they were able to use them. We don't know if things went extinct when the Ikiribas arrived. We do know that well, we don't have a direct link, but my best guess is that a lot of these things were probably fished out to support trade between Kiribati and Taiwan, particularly looking at shark fins. We go through and we look at the exports, and there were tons, literal tons of shark fins being exported during the first half of the 1900s. And shark populations don't grow that quickly. So it's possible that that's where we saw those extinctions coming out. And then for Amy's question, well, yes, I mean, I think the biggest changes that we've seen in the ocean environment has been hi, Daniel. Oh, thank you. My 9-year-old son's delivering me a seltzer. I appreciate. The biggest changes we've seen have been it's rising. The water temperature is rising. And so we're seeing that those corals are getting, yeah, he is a good kid. That those corals are getting degraded, that the land that people have is getting eroded, their freshwater lens, their source of fresh water is getting salty. And so we are seeing big changes there. And so that has impacts as to when we think about doing conservation, like what is the type of world that we want to, do we want to go back to an area in the 1850s, and are we able to do that, or has the whole ocean changed so much that it may not be possible to just go back in time, and we have to think about something moving forward. The skeletons are not preserved because the fish are cartilaginous. So their jaws are preserved pretty well, their teeth are preserved pretty well, but what we would call the postcranial skeleton, so basically their skull back, that does not preserve particularly well. We do have, in the Field Museum, we do have a roll of whale shark skin. So somebody skinned a whale shark. Remember, shark skin is basically small teeth, right? It's the same, the denticles, it's the same idea. So the skin preserves pretty well. And so I've got this like 35-foot long roll of whale shark that you can roll out. But no, we don't have a whole lot of the sort of the postcranial, the back half of the fish protected. There's one thing I wanted to say. I wasn't exactly sure where to fit it in, but I do want to talk a little bit about how these were used. And this is information from missionaries, so take it with a grain of salt. But when two villages wanted to come into conflict, they would choose a champion. At least that's what the missionaries called it. And what would happen is the two big beefy guys would come out. They would have braided or corded coconut armor. They would have shark teeth on their knuckles, like knuckle dusters. They would have a preserved blowfish helmet with the spine sticking out, and they would have these big swords that we saw opening up with. And those swords would have were just sort of festooned with these teeth. Then there was a second row, and remember there were those pole arms, those 2.1 intern long pole arms. Those pole arms were run by the sort of your second stringers, and they would kind of reach up and they would try to jab at the other guy while the two big guys faced off. So the two big guys would be facing off, and then there would be this sort of aerial combat going against them. And then the third line was the women, who would have clubs like these. This is Fijian, but it's the same idea. Would have these handheld clubs. This thing weighs about 3 pounds, and they would be hucking them sort of past their people into the other line. So there would be this big combat going on, face to face, like sort of a melee combat, and then you'd have this kind of ranged attack of 2 levels going on behind it. And so what you would get is this really, really ritualized combat. And they weren't often done to the death. They were often done to capitulation or to first blood, because even on a small island, there are sort of blood prices to be paid if you kill people, and you kind of need everybody to work together to survive when you're rough out there. When it's rough out there. So I wanted to just to mention that, because I think some of that ideas of the teeth on the weapons factors really closely into the resources that Randy has worked with. So with that, I'm going to hand that over to Randy. And I'll stop sharing and we can go over to the resources. But thank you all very much for the time and the questions. I appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah, so before I go into the actual resource, I want to say that Dr. Drew and I had discussions about, where we were going to take this lesson. And at the outset, we wanted to do something about non-traditional sources of information. We also wanted to tie in something about indigenous cultures and ecological history, right? So one of our first ideas was using indigenous place names to try to, glean some ecological information. I live in Hawaii, so and it's pretty interesting because there are Hawaiian place names. There are new Hawaiian place names because each subsequent population that comes in will change the name or something. There's some, I didn't even know this, but there's some place names that they have Hawaiian names, but they're actually given by like missionaries or people that settled there, and anyway, so it's a lot of work just to get to the original Hawaiian names, and then finding out what kind of ecological information you could glean from that is also, it's also something where you would have to really delve into the culture and try to come to an understanding as the ancient Hawaiians understood things. So it's kind of it's a worthy project, but it's kind of difficult. So we kind of took a different route, and we wanted to go with something that was, I think, a clearer analog to what Dr. Drew did. So we have Bishop Museum over here, and they do have displays of Hawaiian shark tooth weapons, which are called leo mano. Le is like a wreath, and then mano is the Hawaiian word for shark. So basically it's like shark's wreath or something. Okay. Oh, okay. So so at the outset of this lesson, we display a phenomenon. We show the Ikiribas weapon on the left-hand side, and then we display three sort of versions of Hawaiian shark tooth weapons. And this would be something where the students would kind of compare and contrast just based on what they see. And then after that, we go into having the students identify what specific shark teeth they see in the Hawaiian shark tooth weapons. We give them like a shark tooth identification guide. So these are just 11 sort of representative species of sharks that are known to frequent Hawaii's waters. So we have the students kind of look at the weapons and try to see if they can identify what shark tooths are present in the Hawaiian weapons. And then the question that we sort of try to focus on is why did the Hawaiian people choose to use those specific species of shark teeth in their weapons. And we try to attack that question from 3 angles. So in the first activity, we just basically look at where these Hawaiian sharks are found. You know, some of these species tend to be more coastal. They tend to prefer the warmer equatorial waters, whereas other shark species are more pelagic or open ocean. And so, you know, students would compare the geographical distributions of those 11 species with world temperature map, ocean temperature map, and also oceanic depth map, you know, and try to come up with, you know, see certain trends. Like there's certain sharks that are coastal, prefer warm water. Other sharks are more pelagic. And, you know, that would kind of get at the idea that, you know, the Hawaiians would probably encounter certain species of sharks with greater frequency versus others, you know. And then we go into the second activity where we're looking specifically at the shapes of the shark teeth. So in this activity, you know, we give the students a template. They basically put it onto oak tag. They cut out these shark tooth shapes, and they're doing 2 tests, one for stabbing and cutting. So we used like tissue paper as I guess, analog for the body tissue. And anyway, for the stabbing test, you know, one student holds the tissue paper taut, and then the other student, and you have to tell the students this, not to go in like really fast, you know, but, you know, just to gently and slowly apply pressure down. And this is perpendicular pressure to the tissue, and just see how easily or how easy or difficult it is for you to penetrate through, and also how smooth and or rough the penetration is. And then we do a second test where we're measuring cutting. So for this, you have to make a small incision in the tissue paper first. Same thing though, but the student puts the tip of the tooth into that incision, and then this time they pull, like they apply more like transverse or parallel pressure that's parallel to the surface of the tissue. And then same thing, they try to see how easy or difficult was that cut, how smooth or rough was the cut. And basically based on that, they try to rank the shark teeth in terms of stabbing ability and cutting ability, you know. So from that activity, we're trying to show that the shape of the tooth really does determine the function, at least as far as you know, the tools or artifacts that it might be used in, you know. And yeah, there's another slideshow that kind of goes through the shark tooth shapes. In my class, when I did this, I found this was a good way to kind of bring the class together and, you know, have students share about what their rankings were and everything like that, you know. And then for the third part of the third activity, again, you know, we're looking at these cultural artifacts. And with the first 2 activities, we're basically looking at it from the outside, like looking at where the sharks come from and also like the shape of the shark teeth. But because it's a cultural artifact, I mean, really, in order to really understand it or come to a better understanding, we have to try to understand things from within the culture. So to that end, like we conducted an interview with, this is Kapaliku Maile, who is the education programs manager over at the Bishop Museum. He's very, very knowledgeable, you know, and basically we have a playlist where he goes through about like 7 topics on how Hawaiians related to sharks. And interspersed within that playlist are some like slideshows, you know, highlighting different aspects of Hawaiian culture. Like this is like the Hawaiian chiefs and their relationship with sharks. Yeah. And there's also a slideshow about like, similar to what Dr. Drew was talking about. There's a different version, but similarly dangerous, I guess, about how the Hawaiians would go out and catch sharks. Yeah. So again, we can never be complete about these things, but we did want to give students a better sense of the cultural understanding, behind the use of shark and shark teeth weapons. Yeah, let me just address a question that came up about like getting the shark teeth. So we didn't use any real shark teeth. Yeah, I mean, what I did like implement this lesson with students, but at no time were they well, I have to amend that, but so I just show them for the phenomenon portion, I just show them pictures of the shark tooth weapons, yeah. And then as far as like it's the second activity where they're actually using the teeth to cut into the tissue paper. That's just cut out of oak tag. So they just get a template and then they glue it onto oak tag, and then they use that to measure cutting or stabbing ability. And I mean, I was in a breakout room, and yeah, I did, a friend of mine lent me some actual shark teeth, like assorted shark teeth in a plastic bag, but I was not comfortable with having them take it out and like, mess with each other or actually steal them or things like that, because they're very small. So I had them just keep it in the bag and just kind of look at it and pass it around. But yeah, shark teeth. At least with that age demographic, I'm not sure I would trust them with the real thing. Yeah, so.
Josh, there's a really good question in here about, and you kind of talked about how they're attached, but is there any like fossil record information for these islands, and are you using that to like cross-reference any of the data that you're collecting in your work?
There's not really fossil data because they are a low coral atoll, so they don't have the right sedimentology for that. But basically, what we try to do is go back to early museum collections. The museum up at Harvard had some sharks collected right around this time to double check to see if there were holdings there. But really what was, to me, the most exciting about this was we were able to really kind of go back about as far as we can with that. So, this is, as far as we've been able to go back, we've pushed the envelope, but there doesn't look like there's a paleontological layer to go back even further.
So this was incredible. I also wanted to ask one more question about, were people using sharks in similar ways, not in sort of this island community? So when we look at Cape Cod or the Atlantic coast, where we also see pelagic shark populations, do we find shark tooth artifacts of that type?
Not like this. The use of the teeth as weapons seems to be largely a native Pacific phenomena. But where we do see a lot of use of shark products is their skin. And I had mentioned this before, the skin, because the dermal denticles, it's really rough. It's like a sandpaper. And so people were using it either as sandpaper aboard sailing vessels, or you do see a lot of even sort of European weapons having the hilt wrapped in swords, the sword wrapped in shark skin, because it's just really it doesn't slip if your hands get sweaty, and it's pretty robust. So we do see that used throughout the globe.
Yeah, I think Kapaliku Maile at the Bishop Museum, he was talking about shark skin. Yeah, and he did say that the Hawaiians used it as sandpaper, but also as like drum heads or drum skin, because he was saying that they didn't have access to cows back then, so the only animals they brought with them were like pigs and dogs. dogs are too small. And then pigs, they said that the skin is not really good for drumheads. So, but shark skin tends to have that toughness. So yeah, so anyway.
Well, we want to thank you both for bringing your knowledge and sharing kind of your collaboration with us today. It was super interesting.